Good evening, and welcome to Dream History. You're safe here, and you can let your mind settle for a moment. Take a slow, comfortable breath, and allow the day to loosen its weight around you. If these calm journeys bring you peace, you may subscribe whenever it feels right, quietly, naturally, without any hurry at all. Now, a gentle story begins. Tonight, we step into ancient Rome, a world of narrow streets and crowded courtyards, worn stone stairways, flickering oil lamps, and soft footsteps moving between tall, shadowed walls. A place where mornings began before sunrise, where evening air cooled the heated stone, and where daily life unfolded in slow, steady rhythms beneath the wide Roman sky. Let us wander there, slowly, softly, and let Rome rise around us in the calm of the night. When most people think of ancient Rome, they imagine stone monuments, wide roads, powerful armies, marble statues, crowded forums, and a city that feels permanent and unstoppable, a place that seems to exist above ordinary human struggle. Yet the reality for most people who lived there was far quieter, more exhausting, and far less glorious, because Rome was not only a symbol of power, but a living organism that consumed enormous amounts of food, labor, and energy every single day. And behind its walls lived hundreds of thousands of ordinary people whose lives were shaped not by conquest or politics, but by routine, scarcity, and dependence. In the early morning, long before speeches or official business began, the city was already awake, not because it was ambitious, but because survival required movement, as laborers, porters, slaves, freedmen, and poor citizens stepped out into narrow streets that smelled of dust, waste, smoke, and stale oil, moving carefully between tall apartment buildings where light barely reached the ground, carrying tools, baskets, and empty stomachs into another day that looked almost exactly like the one before. Most city dwellers did not live in elegant houses, but in crowded insulae, multi-story apartment blocks built quickly and cheaply, where rooms were small, walls thin, and privacy almost non-existent, and where families slept close together, often sharing space with lodgers or extended relatives, knowing that fire, collapse, or eviction were always possible because rent had to be paid and work could disappear without warning. Life inside the city was dense and loud, yet strangely fragile, because Rome produced very little of what it consumed, and every loaf of bread, every amphora of oil, every jug of wine depended on forces far beyond the city walls, even though most people rarely thought about that connection directly, only feeling it when prices rose or supplies failed to arrive. Ordinary Romans worked wherever work could be found, unloading ships at river ports, carrying goods through markets, shaping clay in workshops, repairing roads, cleaning public spaces, or waiting each morning in hopes that someone with money would need their strength for a few hours. And even those with stable trades lived close to the edge, because illness, injury, or a poor season could quickly turn stability into hunger. Food was the quiet center of urban life, not as pleasure but as anxiety, because bread was eaten daily, often in simple forms, and when grain supplies were delayed or disrupted, Fear spread faster than rumors, reminding everyone that the city was only ever a few days away from crisis, despite its grandeur. Public grain distributions existed, but they were limited, controlled, and never guaranteed for all, and many people depended on markets where prices shifted constantly, influenced by weather, transport, and political decisions made far away, creating a sense of dependence that shaped how ordinary people thought about time, work, and risk. The streets themselves told this story if one paid attention, as carts creaked under heavy loads, animals were driven through narrow passages, and merchants argued over measures and weights, all signs of a system that functioned only through constant movement, because nothing in Rome stayed still for long. Even rest was shaped by this reality. Evenings brought exhaustion rather than leisure, with families retreating indoors, sharing simple meals, conserving oil for lamps, and preparing for another early morning, knowing that the city would demand the same effort again tomorrow. Rome, for all its monuments, was not sustained by marble or law, but by invisible chains of supply that stretched outward across the countryside, binding the lives of urban workers to fields they would never see, and to people whose names they would never know. Most Romans understood this intuitively, even if they could not describe it, because they felt the city's hunger in their own bodies, and learned to read signs of abundance or shortage in the markets, in the weight of bread, and in the tension of crowds. This is why the city, despite its noise and scale, always carried an undercurrent of vulnerability, a quiet awareness that its survival depended on forces beyond its control, and that every day of normal life was the result of countless unseen efforts taking place far from the stone streets and towering walls. As we stand here listening to the early sounds of the city and watching ordinary people begin their work, it becomes clear that Rome was not an isolated miracle, but a consumer at the center of a vast system, and to understand how this city truly functioned, we must follow the path of its food, its materials, and its labor outward, away from the crowded streets, beyond the gates, and into the quieter world that sustained everything we see. Inside Rome, life for ordinary people unfolded within a space that was always too full, too loud, and never truly at rest, because the city gathered human bodies the way it gathered goods, stacking them upward in tall buildings and pressing them together along narrow streets where movement itself became a form of labor. And for those who lived here, the city was not a symbol of opportunity, but a daily test of endurance that began before sunrise and ended only when darkness forced activity to slow. Most urban residents woke early not from ambition but from necessity, as daylight was precious and work unpredictable, and the first hours of the morning were often spent securing water, arranging tools, or simply finding a place where one's labor could be exchanged for food or coin, because employment for many was informal, temporary, and competitive, especially for free poor citizens and freedmen who lacked stable contracts or patronage. Slaves formed a constant presence in this environment, working alongside free people in workshops, households, construction sites, and markets. And although their legal status differed sharply, their physical experience of the city was often similar, shaped by long hours, repetitive tasks, and constant supervision, reminding everyone that Rome's productivity depended on bodies that could be controlled and replaced. Markets were the beating heart of this urban system, not as places of abundance, but as spaces of negotiation and anxiety, where prices were argued, measures inspected, and rumors spread quickly, because a delay in grain shipments or a poor harvest elsewhere could immediately affect what ordinary people were able to eat, forcing families to adjust portions, substitute cheaper foods, or skip meals entirely without ceremony or complaint. Work inside the city took many forms, yet almost all of it was physical, whether lifting, carrying, shaping, cleaning, or selling, and even skilled artisans lived close to the same edge as unskilled laborers, because tools broke, customers disappeared, and illness could halt income without warning, leaving households vulnerable in a city where rent and food did not pause out of sympathy. Housing reinforced this pressure, as insulae were crowded and unstable, often built quickly with poor materials, rising several stories high and packed with small rooms that trapped heat in summer and cold in winter, while fires, collapses, and evictions were common enough to be expected rather than feared, creating a background tension that shaped how people slept, stored possessions, and interacted with neighbors. Privacy was rare, not only because walls were thin, but because daily life spilled into shared spaces, with cooking smells, arguments, laughter, and crying passing easily from one room to another, making each household part of a larger collective experience that offered little solitude but a certain shared understanding of hardship. Food preparation itself reflected this reality, as many urban residents relied on bakeries, street vendors, or communal ovens, lacking the space or fuel to cook extensively at home, and meals were simple, repetitive, and functional, designed to sustain the body rather than delight it, reinforcing the idea that pleasure was secondary to survival in a place where resources were always stretched. Water had to be fetched or purchased, sanitation was limited, and waste accumulated quickly in dense neighborhoods, contributing to disease and discomfort that were accepted as normal rather than exceptional, because city life offered few alternatives, and leaving the city permanently was not an option for most. Even moments of rest were shaped by dependence, as evenings brought exhaustion rather than leisure, with families gathering briefly before sleep, conserving lamp oil and preparing mentally for another day that would demand the same effort, the same movement, and the same reliance on systems they could not control. What defined urban life most sharply was this constant dependence, not only on employers or patrons, but on the uninterrupted flow of goods into the city, because Rome itself was an enormous mouth that never closed, consuming grain, oil, wine, and labor at a scale that no single neighborhood or group could sustain on its own. Ordinary people felt this dependence daily, not through abstract knowledge of supply chains, but through the weight of bread in their hands, the price spoken at the market, and the tension that rose when rumors of shortage spread, reminding them that the city's power rested on a fragile balance that could tip at any moment. As we remain within the city for now, listening to the noise of work and watching crowds move through streets built long before they existed, it becomes increasingly clear that Rome's greatness was inseparable from its vulnerability, and that to understand how ordinary people survived here, we must look beyond the walls, because the city itself was only the final destination in a much longer story that began far from stone and crowd, in places where the work was slower, quieter, and far more closely tied to the land. At the center of Rome's daily survival stood its markets, not as places of abundance and choice in the modern sense, but as fragile meeting points where the city's dependence on the outside world became visible, measured, and quietly feared, because every basket of grain, every sack of flour, every amphora of oil represented not wealth, but continuity, and continuity was never guaranteed in a city that could not feed itself. Ordinary people learned to read the markets the way farmers read the sky, noticing small changes in price, weight, and availability, understanding that these signs carried meaning far beyond the stall in front of them, because a shortage here meant failure somewhere else, in a distant field, along a road, or at a river crossing that most urban residents would never see. Grain dominated this system, not because it was luxurious, but because it was essential, forming the base of bread and porridge that sustained bodies across all social levels. And although Rome developed systems of storage, distribution, and control, these systems were always under strain, relying on constant movement and coordination across regions, seasons, and weather patterns that no administrator could fully command. For ordinary people, this complexity was not abstract. They encountered it directly when waiting in lines, negotiating with sellers, or watching officials inspect measures and seals, knowing that even a small disruption could ripple outward, raising prices and shrinking portions without warning. The city's scale magnified these effects because feeding hundreds of thousands of people required enormous quantities of food arriving daily, and unlike smaller towns that could rely on nearby fields, Rome depended on a vast hinterland, connected by roads, rivers, and ports that functioned only through continuous maintenance and labor. Transport itself was slow and vulnerable, as carts broke, animals fell ill, ships were delayed by weather, and storage could spoil, creating points of failure that were understood intuitively by those whose meals depended on timely arrival. Markets therefore carried an undercurrent of tension even on ordinary days, as sellers watched the flow of goods and buyers adjusted expectations, learning to substitute cheaper grains, stretch meals, or reduce consumption when necessary, not as acts of strategy but as habits shaped by experience. Public grain distributions offered some relief, yet they were limited in scope and access, structured to maintain order rather than comfort, and many people remained outside these systems, relying instead on daily purchases that exposed them directly to market fluctuations. Even those who received rations understood that these distributions were not infinite, and that political decisions, administrative errors, or distant events could alter them, reinforcing the sense that urban survival rested on factors beyond individual control. The physical spaces of storage and measurement reflected this reality, with warehouses filled and emptied in cycles, officials recording quantities, and guards ensuring order, all signs of a system designed to manage scarcity rather than eliminate it. Ordinary workers interacted with these systems as laborers carrying sacks, repairing buildings, or cleaning spaces, their bodies forming the connective tissue that allowed grain to move from ship to storehouse to market stall, yet their own access to food remained uncertain, highlighting a contradiction at the heart of urban life. The city's dependence extended beyond grain to oil, wine, and other staples, each with its own roots and risks, yet grain remained the most emotionally charged because it represented the thin line between normal life and hunger, a line that everyone understood, even if few spoke of it openly. Conversations in markets often turned to rumors of poor harvests, delayed shipments, or unrest elsewhere, not as idle gossip, but as practical assessments of future conditions, influencing decisions made quietly at household level about saving, spending, and sharing. In this way, the market functioned not only as an economic space, but as a sensorium of the empire's health, translating distant agricultural realities into immediate urban experience, and teaching ordinary people to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. As we observe this daily exchange of goods and concern, it becomes clear that Rome's ability to sustain itself rested on a delicate balance maintained through effort rather than abundance, and that the city's apparent stability masked a continuous struggle to align consumption with supply. This struggle tied urban life to rural labor in an unbroken chain, even if the links were invisible to those who walked the stone streets. And as the noise of the market fades into the background, the question raised earlier grows sharper and more unavoidable, because every transaction points outward, away from the city, toward fields, farms, and people whose work made these markets possible, inviting us to follow that path and understand the quieter world on which Rome ultimately depended. Beyond the noise of the markets and the movement of goods, ordinary urban life in Rome continued inside living spaces that were rarely designed for comfort, privacy, or rest, but instead reflected the pressures of population density, limited resources, and social inequality. Because for most people, housing was not a refuge from the city, but another environment that demanded adaptation and endurance. The majority of ordinary Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings packed tightly along narrow streets, rising several floors high and constructed quickly with materials that prioritized speed and profit over safety, meaning that walls were thin, floors uneven, and structural stability uncertain, especially in the upper levels where poorer residents were forced to live. These buildings were crowded not only vertically, but horizontally, as families, individuals, and sometimes unrelated groups occupied single rooms, sharing walls, sounds, and smells with neighbors they could not avoid, creating an atmosphere in which personal space barely existed and daily life unfolded in constant proximity to others. You may take a slow breath. Light was limited because windows were small and streets narrow, leaving interiors dim even during the day, while at night oil lamps provided weak illumination that emphasized shadows rather than dispelling them, shaping routines that ended early not by choice but by necessity. Water access was another constraint, as few apartments had direct supply, forcing residents to carry water from public fountains upstairs and through corridors, turning a basic need into physical labor repeated multiple times each day, especially burdensome for women, children, and the elderly. Cooking inside these spaces was difficult and dangerous because open flames increased the risk of fire, a constant threat in densely built neighborhoods where a single spark could spread rapidly, making many families rely on street vendors or communal facilities for prepared food, further tying survival to external systems beyond household control. Sanitation was minimal, with waste often disposed of through shared latrines or improvised methods, contributing to odors and health risks that residents learned to tolerate as normal because alternatives were limited and improvement rare. Noise permeated these living spaces without pause, as sounds from the street, neighboring rooms, and upper floors blended into a continuous backdrop of footsteps, voices, animals, and carts, meaning that silence was not a feature of urban life, but an absence that few experienced. Sleep itself was shaped by these conditions, as people rested when they could rather than when they wished, adapting to heat, noise, and exhaustion, often sharing bedding or floor space to conserve warmth or room, especially among the poorest households. Wealthier citizens lived differently, in domus with courtyards, controlled access, and private water, but these spaces represented a minority experience that most urban residents knew only from the outside, reinforcing awareness of social distance through everyday observation rather than abstract comparison. Even so, all urban housing reflected the city's dependence on constant maintenance, as walls cracked, roofs leaked, and repairs were made temporarily or not at all, requiring residents to live with a sense of impermanence that shaped attitudes toward possessions and stability. Children grew up within these confined environments, learning early to navigate crowds, stairs, and shared spaces, developing practical awareness rather than protected childhoods, while adults structured routines to minimize conflict and risk, choosing hours, routes, and habits that allowed them to function within crowded conditions. In this way, housing did not simply shelter urban populations, but actively shaped behavior, expectations, and resilience, turning survival into a collective negotiation rather than an individual achievement. As we move through these interiors, it becomes clear that urban life demanded constant adjustment, teaching people to live efficiently, endure discomfort, and rely on systems larger than themselves. And this dependence once again points beyond the city walls, because the materials, food, and labor that sustained even these cramped spaces originated elsewhere, setting the stage for a deeper examination of those who lived closer to the land, whose quieter labor supported the crowded lives unfolding above stone streets. Inside the crowded rooms and unstable buildings of the Roman city, daily life was organized not around personal comfort or emotional closeness, but around a strict and often unspoken hierarchy that determined who worked, who obeyed, who spoke, and who endured in silence, because the Roman household was not simply a family unit, but a structure of authority, labor, and survival, shaped by law, tradition, and economic pressure. At the center of this structure stood the paterfamilias, the adult male head of the household, whose legal authority extended over wives, children, slaves, and property, granting him power that was rarely questioned openly, not because it was always enforced harshly, but because it was embedded so deeply into daily routines that it appeared natural and inevitable. Women in urban households carried much of the invisible labor that sustained everyday life, managing food preparation, cleaning, childcare, and textile work within cramped spaces, while also navigating restrictions on public presence and legal independence, meaning that their contribution was constant, yet rarely acknowledged outside the household. Children were not sheltered from responsibility, but introduced early to work appropriate to their age and status, running errands, assisting in workshops, carrying water, or helping with domestic tasks, learning through repetition rather than instruction, that survival depended on usefulness rather than choice. Slaves formed an essential layer of this domestic world, present in many urban households not as symbols of wealth, but as practical necessities, performing labor that freed free citizens to pursue trades, manage shops, or seek daily wages, while their own lives were defined by lack of autonomy and constant dependence on the household's stability. Status differences were reinforced through everyday interactions rather than formal declarations, visible in where people slept, who ate first, who spoke freely, and who waited for instruction, creating a social order that was experienced moment by moment rather than debated in theory. Marriage in urban Rome functioned primarily as an economic and social arrangement, linking households, securing labor cooperation, and producing legitimate heirs, rather than as a personal partnership centered on emotional fulfillment. And this practical approach shaped expectations for both men and women throughout their lives. Extended family members often shared living space when possible, especially in times of hardship, blurring boundaries between nuclear households and broader kin networks, because mutual support was essential in a city where illness, injury, or loss of work could quickly destabilize survival. Even leisure, when it existed, was structured by status, as free men might gather briefly in public spaces, while women and slaves remained tied to domestic responsibilities, reinforcing separation through routine rather than explicit rule. You may pause here, gently. Conflict within households was managed quietly, not through formal resolution, but through endurance and adaptation, because open dispute threatened stability in environments already strained by crowding and scarcity. In this way, the Roman urban household functioned less as a private refuge and more as a small working system embedded within the larger city economy, where every member contributed according to position and necessity, and where survival depended on maintaining order more than seeking satisfaction. As these families labored, negotiated authority, and endured together within the city, they remained deeply connected to forces beyond urban walls, because the food they ate, the materials they used, and the work that sustained them were all tied to production elsewhere, making the household not an isolated unit, but a point of convergence between city demand and rural supply, a connection that becomes increasingly clear as we begin to follow those resources back toward the land itself. Before the sun fully rises over the rooftops and narrow streets of the Roman city, daily life is already resuming rather than beginning, because for most ordinary people, the day does not start with intention or choice, but with necessity, as bodies accustomed to routine wake in dark rooms where light enters only faintly through doorways or small openings, and the first movements are quiet, practiced, and efficient, shaped by years of repetition. Men who depend on daily wages or workshop labor leave their homes early, often before heat builds in the streets, carrying tools, baskets, or nothing at all except the expectation of work. knowing that arriving late may mean losing a day's income entirely, while shopkeepers lift wooden shutters, sweep dust from thresholds, and prepare simple displays of goods meant to attract passing customers rather than inspire admiration. You may take a slow, easy breath. Women remain largely within the domestic space, beginning long sequences of tasks that structure the household's survival: grinding grain, preparing simple food, managing children, and maintaining order in confined interiors where clutter quickly becomes unmanageable, while also coordinating with slaves or relatives to ensure that nothing essential is neglected. Children move constantly through the city as messengers, helpers, and apprentices, carrying water from public fountains, delivering items between workshops and homes, or assisting in family trades, learning the rhythms of urban life through movement rather than instruction. As the morning progresses, streets grow louder and more crowded, filled with voices, animals, carts, and the sounds of labor, while heat begins to press down on stone surfaces, forcing workers to adjust pace, seek shade briefly, or retreat indoors when possible, because exhaustion and dehydration are constant risks in a city where physical labor dominates most occupations. Midday brings a short pause rather than rest, marked by simple meals eaten quickly, often consisting of bread, porridge, or leftovers, consumed standing or sitting wherever space allows, because extended leisure is a luxury few can afford, and time away from work directly threatens income. The afternoon continues with renewed effort despite fatigue, as artisans shape materials, laborers carry loads, and domestic tasks resume without clear boundaries between work and rest, while the city's infrastructure, its water systems, roads, and markets, supports movement but does not reduce strain. You may pause here, just briefly. As daylight fades, activity slowly contracts inward. Shops close, workshops quiet, and families gather in cramped interiors or shared courtyards, eating modest evening meals by lamplight, discussing practical concerns rather than plans for advancement, because survival tomorrow depends on endurance today rather than ambition. Night brings darkness quickly, and with it a different set of dangers, as poorly lit streets become hazardous, prompting most people to remain indoors, locking doors when possible, settling close together for warmth and safety, and sleeping lightly amid noise, smells, and the constant presence of others. This daily cycle repeats with minimal variation day after day, shaping bodies, expectations, and social behavior through repetition rather than reflection. And as ordinary Romans endure this rhythm within the city, their dependence on food, materials, and labor drawn from beyond the urban boundary becomes increasingly apparent, setting the stage for understanding how life outside the city sustained everything within it. As the city's dense streets, constant noise, and compressed living spaces gradually loosen their grip beyond the gates, the Roman world begins to change, not abruptly, but subtly, as stone gives way to packed earth, buildings spread farther apart, and movement slows, revealing a quieter environment that exists in direct service to the city, yet operates by a different rhythm entirely, because everything that sustains urban life, food, fuel, animals, raw materials, must pass through this outer zone, before reaching crowded markets and narrow doorways. Roads leading away from the city are busy but purposeful, traveled by carts loaded with grain, amphorae of oil and wine, bundles of firewood, and livestock driven on foot, while pedestrians include farmers, tenants, slaves, and hired laborers whose work connects countryside and city without granting them access to urban comfort or status. Small roadside settlements appear at regular intervals, consisting of modest houses, storage buildings, shrines, and inns that serve travelers and traders, not as destinations, but as points of exchange where goods, news, and labor briefly intersect before continuing onward. Life here is shaped less by crowds and commerce than by distance and timing, because missing a market day or delaying transport can mean loss of income or spoilage, and so routines are organized around movement, weather, and seasonal demands rather than urban schedules. Fields begin to dominate the landscape, irregular in shape and size, bounded by low walls, ditches, or simple markers, reflecting generations of gradual division rather than planned design, while farmers work these plots with tools that are simple, heavy, and familiar, relying on strength, coordination, and experience rather than speed or innovation. Houses outside the city are fewer and more widely spaced, built close to land they serve, and though they lack urban congestion, they offer no greater comfort, as interiors remain dark, furniture sparse, and labor constant, with every household functioning as both living space and workplace. You can pause, just briefly. Social life thins as well, not because people are isolated by choice, but because distance limits interaction, making family and household the primary unit of cooperation, while neighbors assist each other only when necessity demands it, such as during planting, harvest, or construction. Time here feels different, measured not by market hours or city noise, but by daylight, weather, and the slow progress of work across fields and paths, creating a sense of continuity that contrasts with the urgency of urban survival. Yet this quieter world carries greater vulnerability because failure of crops, illness among animals, or disruption of transport directly threatens both rural households and the city that depends on them, binding the two environments together through necessity rather than mutual benefit. As the road stretches farther from the city and cultivated land expands in every direction, it becomes clear that the urban Roman world, for all its scale and organization, rests entirely on the endurance, labor, and routine of those who live beyond its walls, preparing the ground for a closer look at rural life, not as a backdrop, but as the foundation of Roman existence itself. Beyond the thinning edge of the city, where roads stretch longer between milestones and cultivated land spreads outward in uneven patterns shaped by soil quality, water access, and generations of inheritance, agriculture emerges not as one activity among many, but as the central structure around which all rural life is organized, because for the vast majority of people living outside Roman cities, survival depends entirely on the successful management of land that is often difficult, unpredictable, and demanding in every season. Farming in the Roman countryside is not romantic or orderly, but physical and repetitive, governed by cycles that leave little room for delay or error. Since grain must be sown at the right moment, weeds cleared before they choke young shoots, and harvest completed before weather, pests, or spoilage destroy months of effort. Fields are typically small and irregular, divided over time rather than planned at once, and worked by households that include free peasants, tenant farmers, slaves, and hired laborers, all contributing their strength and time to ensure that enough food is produced not only for their own consumption, but also for rent, taxes, and market obligations that bind rural producers to urban demand. The most essential crops, wheat and barley, require careful preparation of soil using wooden plows tipped with iron, drawn slowly by oxen whose health and endurance are as critical as the farmer's own, because a weakened animal can delay work long enough to threaten the entire growing season. Alongside grain, olives and grapes dominate many regions, especially where soil and climate allow, and these crops demand patience rather than speed, as olive trees take years to mature and vineyards require constant pruning, training, and protection, rewarding long-term stability but punishing neglect. Agricultural labor fills nearly every daylight hour during peak seasons, with planting, harvesting, threshing, and storage occurring in intense bursts of activity that involve entire households and neighboring families, while quieter periods are devoted to maintenance, repair, and preparation rather than rest, because tools wear down, fences collapse, and storage vessels must be kept intact to protect precious yields. Women and children are deeply involved in this process, not as helpers but as essential contributors, performing tasks such as weeding, gathering, carrying, sorting, and processing grain into flour or porridge, while older family members provide knowledge gained from years of experience, guiding decisions about timing, crop rotation, and resource use. Food production does not end with harvest because storing grain safely through winter requires dry conditions, sealed containers, and constant vigilance against rodents, moisture, and theft, turning storage itself into a daily concern that shapes the design of houses, barns, and granaries scattered across the countryside. Livestock farming operates alongside crop cultivation, with sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle providing meat, milk, wool, traction, and manure. Yet animals also increase workload rather than ease it, since they must be fed, watered, protected, and cleaned, particularly during winter when grazing is limited and fodder must be rationed carefully to prevent loss before spring. Agricultural life is further complicated by environmental risk, as drought, frost, excessive rain, or disease can destroy crops or animals without warning, leaving families vulnerable to hunger and debt, and forcing them to rely on loans, patronage, or the sale of labor to survive until conditions improve. Despite these risks, innovation is slow because experimentation threatens stability, and most farmers adhere closely to methods that have worked for previous generations, valuing reliability over potential gains. The city remains a distant presence during these routines, felt through the demand for surplus, taxes, and occasional market days, but daily agricultural life is largely self-contained, grounded in the immediate realities of soil, weather, and labor, making it clear that Rome's vast population and urban complexity are sustained not by spectacle or power alone, but by countless rural households repeating the same exhausting tasks year after year, laying the groundwork for understanding how animals, food, and labor intertwine even more deeply in the lives of those who live far from city walls. In the Roman countryside, animals are not separate from daily life or kept at a distance as background elements, but exist in constant proximity to human routines, shaping work, schedules, smells, sounds, and responsibilities from early morning until night, because livestock are not symbols of wealth or comfort, but practical necessities whose care determines whether a household can function at all. Oxen are the most visible and indispensable animals in agricultural labor, slow-moving yet powerful, harnessed to wooden plows and carts, and treated with a mixture of dependence and caution, since an injured or exhausted ox can halt planting or transport entirely, leaving crops unworked and produce undelivered, while horses remain relatively rare for ordinary farmers and are more often associated with transport or status than with daily field work. Sheep and goats occupy a different role, grazing on marginal land unsuitable for crops, converting poor pasture into wool, milk, and occasional meat, yet requiring constant attention to prevent loss from disease, predators, or wandering, as fencing is imperfect and grazing often takes place in open landscapes where supervision is essential. Pigs are among the most common animals in rural settlements, valued for their ability to eat scraps, forage freely, and convert waste into meat, though they too require management, particularly during colder months or when nearby forests are unavailable, tying their survival to the household's overall food balance. Animals are fed, watered, cleaned, and moved daily, often at the same hours each morning and evening, and these routines are so deeply embedded in rural life that they structure the day as clearly as human meals or rest periods, with children frequently tasked with gathering fodder, leading animals to water, or watching herds while adults focus on heavier labor. During winter, animals are brought closer to human living spaces, sometimes housed in attached structures or nearby pens, not only for protection from cold, but to preserve valuable body heat, increasing the presence of animal sounds and smells inside domestic areas, and further blurring the line between human and animal environments. Pause briefly. Animal products shape nearly every aspect of material life, as wool is spun and woven into clothing, hides are used for tools and footwear, bones are repurposed, and manure is collected and spread to maintain soil fertility, making waste itself a resource that must be managed rather than discarded. The slaughter of animals is infrequent and deliberate, often timed to seasonal needs or specific occasions, because meat represents both nourishment and loss, removing a living resource that might otherwise provide ongoing benefits, and thus decisions about killing livestock carry long-term consequences rather than immediate gratification. Disease among animals presents constant risk, spreading quickly through herds and threatening both food supply and economic stability, while veterinary knowledge remains limited, relying on observation, traditional remedies, and isolation rather than effective treatment. The emotional relationship between people and animals is practical rather than sentimental, shaped by familiarity and dependence rather than affection. Yet the constant presence of livestock creates a shared rhythm of life in which human survival is inseparable from animal labor and health. Through this close coexistence, rural Romans experience a form of daily life that is physical, repetitive, and deeply interwoven with other living beings, revealing that the agricultural system sustaining the empire is not built solely on fields and crops, but on the constant, careful management of animals whose silent work supports every loaf of bread, every garment, and every shipment of food that travels toward the city. For most people living outside Roman cities, food is not a source of pleasure, variety, or choice, but a daily calculation shaped by availability, season, labor, and risk, where meals are built around what can be grown, stored, preserved, or exchanged locally rather than what is desired, and where hunger is not an emergency but a familiar background condition that influences every decision long before it becomes visible. The foundation of the rural diet is grain, most commonly wheat or barley, depending on region and soil, ground into flour or coarse meal and transformed into bread, porridge, or thick gruels that provide calories rather than flavor, eaten repeatedly day after day because grain is filling, storable, and predictable, even if it is monotonous and physically taxing to prepare. Bread is often dense, dark, and unevenly baked, sometimes cooked on hot stones or in simple ovens, and frequently mixed with impurities or alternative grains during poor harvests, while porridge serves as a flexible food that can stretch limited supplies by absorbing water or milk and accommodating small additions of vegetables or legumes when available. Vegetables play a supporting but essential role, including beans, lentils, onions, cabbage, and greens grown in small plots near homes, valued less for taste than for their ability to supplement grain with nutrients and variety, though their availability fluctuates with season and weather, making preservation methods such as drying or pickling important but imperfect. Olive oil, where olives can be grown, is one of the most valuable components of the diet, used sparingly for cooking, lighting, and ritual purposes, while in regions where olives are scarce, animal fats or butter take their place, demonstrating how local environments directly shape daily consumption. Dairy products are more common than meat, with milk, cheese, and sometimes yogurt-like preparations providing protein without requiring the slaughter of animals, making them a practical compromise between nourishment and long-term survival, especially in households that depend on livestock for labor or wool. Pause. Briefly. Meat is eaten infrequently and often unevenly, appearing during seasonal slaughter, festivals, or moments of necessity rather than as a regular part of meals, and when it is consumed, it is used carefully, stretched across multiple dishes, or preserved through salting or drying to maximize its value. Fish and shellfish supplement diets in coastal or riverine areas, providing a more reliable source of protein for some communities, though preservation remains a challenge, leading to the widespread use of salted fish products that trade freshness for durability and transportability. Wine is consumed regularly but diluted with water, serving both as a beverage and a safer alternative to untreated water in some regions, while beer or fermented drinks made from grain appear in certain areas, reflecting regional traditions rather than imperial uniformity. Food storage is a constant concern, with grain kept in jars, pits, or raised structures to protect it from moisture and pests, though losses are common and can quickly transform a stable household into one facing shortage, especially during winter or after poor harvests. Meals are typically simple and shared, eaten quickly during work breaks or in the evening when labor slows, without elaborate preparation or presentation, reinforcing the idea that eating is integrated into the workday rather than set apart from it. Children eat the same foods as adults, learning early to accept limited options and repetitive meals, while elders rely on the same staples, their needs accommodated not through special diets, but through adjusted portions and shared care. Hunger exists not as constant starvation, but as a persistent possibility, shaping attitudes toward waste, sharing, and storage, and teaching rural households to think months ahead rather than days, because survival depends less on abundance than on consistency. Through this lens, food in the Roman countryside reveals a way of life grounded in endurance, where nourishment supports labor, labor supports survival, and meals serve not to delight the senses, but to sustain bodies that must return to the fields, animals, and tools each day, ensuring that the flow of food toward the city continues, even as those who produce it live with constant restraint. Outside the city, work is not a profession chosen for advancement or identity, but a condition of existence that defines social position, daily rhythm, and physical limits, because nearly everyone in the rural Roman world survives only by the continuous use of their body, whether as a free peasant, tenant farmer, hired laborer, freedman, or slave, and because the distinctions between these categories, while legally significant, often blur in practice under the shared weight of exhaustion, routine, and dependence on landowners and seasons. Free peasants work their own small plots or rent land from larger estates, bound by obligations that include rent, taxes, and labor services, which means that their freedom exists mostly on paper, while their daily lives resemble those of dependents who must meet quotas and deadlines, regardless of personal circumstances. Tenant farmers who cultivate land owned by elites are especially vulnerable, as poor harvests do not reduce their obligations, forcing them into debt, loss of tools, or even loss of family members into forms of bonded labor, creating a cycle where work never quite leads to security, but only to temporary stability. Slaves form a visible and essential part of the rural workforce, working alongside free laborers in fields, vineyards, olive groves, and workshops, their lack of legal autonomy marking them socially, yet not sparing them from the same physical strain, long hours, and exposure to weather that define agricultural labor. And while some slaves possess specialized skills, most perform repetitive, physically demanding tasks that wear down the body quickly. Women's labor is constant and multifaceted, extending beyond the household into fields, gardens, and production activities such as spinning, weaving, food processing, and animal care, making their contribution indispensable even though it is rarely acknowledged in formal records, and their workdays often begin before dawn and end late at night, blending domestic and economic labor into a single continuous effort. Children are integrated into work from an early age, not as a form of discipline, but as a necessity, learning tasks such as herding animals, carrying water, collecting fuel, and assisting in harvesting, gradually assuming heavier responsibilities as their bodies allow, which means that childhood is brief and shaped more by labor than by education or leisure. Status in this world is visible not through clothing or wealth, but through control over labor, with landowners and estate managers exerting authority by directing work, setting schedules, and enforcing obligations, while those below them experience status primarily as limitation, knowing where they belong in the hierarchy through the tasks they perform and the orders they receive. Payment for labor varies widely, with some workers receiving coin in wages, others compensated through food, housing, or shares of produce, and many relying on informal arrangements that offer flexibility but little protection, making disputes common and security fragile. Work is seasonal yet relentless, intensifying during planting and harvest and easing slightly during winter, though even then maintenance, repairs, and preparation fill the days, leaving little true rest. Injuries are frequent and often untreated, reducing a person's ability to work and threatening their place within the household or estate, since value is closely tied to physical capacity. In this system, labor is not merely an economic activity, but the foundation of social order, determining who commands, who obeys, and who survives from one season to the next, revealing a rural Roman world where status is earned through endurance rather than mobility, and where work binds individuals to land, households, and obligations with a force stronger than law or ideology. In the countryside beyond the city, clothing is not a marker of fashion, identity, or personal expression, but a practical layer between the human body and an often hostile environment, shaped by weather, labor, and availability rather than taste. And because most rural Romans possess only a small number of garments, what they wear day after day becomes a visible record of work, repair, and gradual decay rather than change. Wool dominates rural clothing because sheep are widespread and wool is durable, warm in winter, and adaptable to rough use, while linen appears less frequently and is usually reserved for lighter garments in warmer seasons or for households with access to flax production, meaning that most people live wrapped in coarse, heavy fabrics that itch, trap heat, and absorb sweat and dirt. The basic garments are simple tunics, often sleeveless or short-sleeved for men working in fields, longer and more layered for women, with cloaks added for warmth or protection against rain, and these garments are cut to conserve material rather than to fit the body precisely, resulting in loose shapes that allow movement but offer little insulation from wind or dust. Footwear is equally practical and limited, with sandals made of leather or simple shoes used when available, though many people work barefoot, especially in fields and around homesteads, because shoes wear out quickly, are difficult to replace, and are saved for travel or colder conditions. Women's labor is constant and multifaceted, extending beyond the household into fields, gardens, and production activities such as spinning, weaving, food processing, and animal care, making their contribution indispensable even though it is rarely acknowledged in formal records, and their workdays often begin before dawn and end late at night, blending domestic and economic labor into a single continuous effort. Children are integrated into work from an early age, not as a form of discipline, but as a necessity, Learning tasks such as herding animals, carrying water, collecting fuel, and assisting in harvesting, gradually assuming heavier responsibilities as their bodies allow, which means that childhood is brief and shaped more by labor than by education or leisure. Status in this world is visible not through clothing or wealth, but through control over labor, with landowners and estate managers exerting authority by directing work, setting schedules, and enforcing obligations, while those below them experience status primarily as limitation, knowing where they belong in the hierarchy through the tasks they perform and the orders they receive. Payment for labor varies widely, with some workers receiving coin in wages, others compensated through food, housing, or shares of produce, and many relying on informal arrangements that offer flexibility but little protection, making disputes common and security fragile. Work is seasonal yet relentless, intensifying during planting and harvest and easing slightly during winter, though even then maintenance, repairs, and preparation fill the days, leaving little true rest. Injuries are frequent and often untreated, reducing a person's ability to work and threatening their place within the household or estate, since value is closely tied to physical capacity. In this system, labor is not merely an economic activity, but the foundation of social order, determining who commands, who obeys, and who survives from one season to the next, revealing a rural Roman world where status is earned through endurance rather than mobility, and where work binds individuals to land, households, and obligations with a force stronger than law or ideology. Beyond the city walls, health is not a condition to be maintained, but a fragile state that can be lost suddenly through injury, infection, exhaustion, or poor harvests. And for ordinary rural Romans, illness is not an interruption of life, but an expected possibility woven into every season of work. Medical knowledge exists, but access to trained physicians is limited outside urban centers, meaning that most people rely on household remedies, local healers, and accumulated experience rather than formal treatment, and this reality shapes how sickness is understood, endured, and managed within families. Minor injuries, such as cuts, sprains, and burns, are common results of daily labor with tools, animals, and fire, and while some heal naturally, others become infected due to lack of proper cleaning or sterile conditions, turning small wounds into serious threats. More severe injuries, including broken bones or deep gashes, often mean permanent disability or death, because recovery requires rest that many households cannot afford when survival depends on continuous labor. Disease spreads easily in rural environments through contaminated water, poor sanitation, and close contact with animals, leading to recurring illnesses such as fevers, gastrointestinal infections, and respiratory problems, especially among children and the elderly. Nutrition plays a crucial role in health, and during years of poor harvest or food shortage, weakened bodies become more vulnerable to disease, creating cycles in which hunger and illness reinforce each other. Child mortality is high, with many children dying in infancy or early childhood from infections, malnutrition, or accidents, and families learn to live with loss as a common part of life rather than a rare tragedy. Women face additional risks related to pregnancy and childbirth, where complications are frequent and often fatal due to lack of medical intervention, making survival to adulthood itself a form of endurance. Herbal remedies are widely used, drawing on plants, oils, and simple preparations passed down through generations. And while some treatments provide relief, many are ineffective or even harmful, yet they persist because alternatives are few. Pain management is minimal, and people learn to work through discomfort, adjusting tasks rather than stopping entirely, because resting too long can threaten the household's stability. Aging brings increasing vulnerability as joints stiffen, strength fades, and chronic pain becomes constant. But elders are rarely idle, contributing through lighter tasks, supervision, and knowledge sharing until they can no longer do so. Death is a familiar presence, occurring at home rather than in medical settings, and communities respond with simple rituals that emphasize continuity rather than prolonged mourning, because life must continue despite loss. In this environment, health is not measured by comfort or longevity, but the ability to keep working, caring, and contributing, and survival itself becomes the primary indicator of success in a world where pain, illness, and risk are not exceptional events, but constant companions of rural Roman life. Outside the city, religion is not a spectacle of temples, crowds, or grand ceremonies, but a quiet, practical presence woven into fields, homes, paths, and seasons, where belief exists less as theology and more as habit, responsibility, and careful attention to forces that cannot be controlled. Ordinary rural Romans do not spend their days debating gods or myths because survival leaves little room for abstraction, and instead they practice religion as a form of maintenance, a way to keep life stable in a world shaped by weather, soil, animals, and chance. The center of belief is the household, where small shrines stand in corners or near entrances, holding simple figures or symbols of the household gods, the Lares and Penates, who are believed to protect the family, the stored food, and the continuity of the home itself. And offerings are modest, consisting of bits of food, wine, oil, or a brief spoken acknowledgement rather than elaborate sacrifice. These rituals are repeated quietly at the start or end of the day, before meals, or at key moments in the agricultural cycle, not because they promise miracles, but because repetition itself creates a sense of order and attentiveness that helps people feel less exposed to uncertainty. In the fields, belief follows the rhythm of work, with small gestures made before planting, harvesting, or moving animals, acknowledging the land as something that must be respected and carefully approached rather than dominated. And this attitude reflects generations of experience with crop failure, storms, and disease that no human effort can fully prevent. Rural festivals exist, tied closely to agricultural milestones such as sowing and harvest, but they are local, restrained, and practical, offering moments of shared food, rest, and recognition rather than dramatic celebration. And their purpose is less about joy than about reinforcing communal cooperation and shared timing. There is little separation between religion and daily life because prayers are brief, gestures are small, and belief does not require withdrawal from work, allowing people to remain productive while still acknowledging unseen forces. Unlike the city, where public cults and imperial rituals reinforce political power, rural religion remains focused on protection, fertility, and continuity, reflecting the needs of people whose lives depend directly on the land. Superstition and local traditions blend easily into these practices, with signs, omens, and inherited rules guiding behavior during uncertain moments, such as unusual weather or illness, because explanation is less important than response. Death rituals are simple and practical, emphasizing respectful handling of the body and remembrance within the family rather than elaborate funerals, reinforcing the idea that life flows forward as individuals pass away. Through all of this, religion functions as a stabilizing framework rather than a source of emotional intensity, offering ordinary people a way to acknowledge uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed by it, and allowing them to return to work, meals, and rest with the quiet sense that they have done what is required to maintain balance in a world that rarely offers guarantees. Beyond the city walls and far from monuments, speeches, and written history, rural life in the Roman world continues in a way that rarely announces itself and never pauses for reflection, because for ordinary people, the goal is not progress, glory, or transformation, but survival carried forward through repetition, habit, and careful endurance. Year after year, the same fields are worked by the same families, the same paths are walked at dawn and dusk, and the same tools are lifted, repaired, and passed down, not because change is feared, but because stability is fragile, and any disruption carries risk that cannot easily be absorbed. Children grow into the roles they have observed since early childhood, learning not through instruction, but through constant exposure to work, fatigue, and responsibility, while elders remain present not as figures of authority alone, but as living memory, holding knowledge of weather patterns, soil behavior, and past failures that shape decisions in subtle ways. Seasons continue to dictate the structure of life, with moments of intense labor followed by quieter periods that are never truly restful, because maintenance, repair, and preparation never fully stop, and even stillness carries purpose. The empire itself remains distant, felt most clearly through taxes, obligations, and occasional officials, but rarely through protection or direct assistance, leaving ordinary people largely dependent on their own labor and local cooperation to endure. Success is measured not in wealth or advancement, but in continuity, in making it through another winter with enough stored food, in keeping animals alive, in maintaining roofs and tools just well enough to last another year. Failure, when it comes, is often quiet as well, marked by hunger, illness, or abandonment rather than dramatic collapse, reinforcing a worldview shaped by caution and restraint. There is little expectation that life will improve significantly for the next generation, only that it might continue in a similar form, and this acceptance is not resignation, but a practical adjustment to a world where resources are limited and security is never guaranteed. As night settles over the countryside, lamps are extinguished early, bodies rest close together, and silence returns to the fields and paths, not as an ending, but as a pause before the cycle resumes once more. In this way, the true foundation of Rome is revealed not in stone or conquest, but in countless ordinary lives lived close to the land, sustained by routine, shaped by necessity, and carried forward quietly, without witnesses, without applause, and without the knowledge that centuries later their endurance would be remembered at all.